So I've gotten quite a few emails, phone calls, things from parents who are asking what to do in specific educational situations that they are not happy with. And I just want to address something critically important that I feel like as parents, we are not taught. And we should be taught this from the day our children access any educational services, whether that be preschool or just going into kindergarten. But at least in the state of Minnesota, again, I'm a school counselor in Minnesota, so that's what I'm speaking to. In the state of Minnesota, it is your legal right as a parent to choose the education that you want for your child. You do not have to go the public school route. You can, of course, go private school. You don't have to go to the main head school district in your city. There are often many charter schools around, depending on where you're located. And you always have the option to do an online education at any point for your child. This means that if you are feeling like the education that your child is getting that you've previously picked isn't necessarily the best fit for them anymore, you can pull them out of school at any point to try a different type of education. As a school counselor, I would always encourage you to wait until the end of a term and before you pull them out to make sure that you have another option for them, or homeschooling will be your choice. Because in the state of Minnesota, again, your child has to be in school, some sort of school, which homeschooling does count. They have to be in school until they are 17. So always do your research ahead of time before you're pulling them out. But again, if you want to try a different charter school because your public school hasn't been the best fit, reach out to them, explain to them what your situation is, find out if they have space. That's always going to be the biggest concern when switching into a new school, is that there is room for your child and that they do have space. Lots of schools are running out of space just because parents are realizing that they have more options. So that would be number one. You can also look to other neighboring districts. So say you live in Minneapolis and you want to look into a St. Paul school or one even in the suburbs, that is also an option. But many districts, again, because of space issues, do not have open enrollment just because there's no room. Okay, the other thing to keep in mind too is just the transportation piece. Unless your child is moving into a private school, you likely would then be on the hook for getting your child to and from school every day. So keep that in mind as well. But it's your right to pick the setting and the type of education that you want your child to have. So please know that there are always other options out there. The other thing that I want to address quickly is just accommodations, alternative options of helping your child through school when a general education setting is not enough. So there are two options. The first one, that's kind of one step up from general education, where your child is still receiving general ed services, is something called a 504. And a 504 is something that can easily be put together in an hour-long meeting with your school's 504 coordinator or maybe a school counselor. And what a 504 is for students who are struggling to be successful in the classroom with their schoolwork in some capacity. Often in my online setting, we see it with students who have a mental health diagnosis. Maybe they struggle with depression or anxiety, where it's almost crippling their ability to be a successful student. A 504 is going to give them accommodations that are going to help them be more successful. So in an online setting, what that might look like is they might get an accommodation for more time to complete projects and assignments. Or if there is testing, it would give them maybe extra time on that test. Now, in a brick and mortar school, it's going to look different because very often the environment creates so much of the problem for students. So it might be an accommodation for a specific seat in the room, or to be able to go to the counselor's office at the drop of a hat if a student maybe has panic disorder or anxiety, things like that. Or maybe, again, it might be accommodations for more time with testing or testing in a quiet room. So there are options that can help your child within the general education classrooms where they can still get help but not be labeled as some parents are concerned about. So that's a 504, that's level 1. And we always do try to have you take the smallest step first unless you're seeing some critical issues. So beyond the 504, the next step is what's called an IEP, or an individual education plan. Now we're talking about special ed services. That's how you get on an IEP. The process to get approved for an IEP usually takes a little bit less than 30 school days, but that's the amount of time that they have to complete it. It involves a lot of testing, a lot of conversations with family and student, and some assessments to really determine what might be inhibiting their education, and then if the IEP is the right route to go to help your student. Now, an IEP is a great alternative for some people because it really does give almost an unlimited amount of accommodations. So in order to figure out what accommodations would be appropriate for your child if they do qualify for an IEP after going through that testing, is you have an IEP team. And usually that's comprised of a case manager. So that's going to be the person from the special ed department who keeps track of your student, who is checking in with them on a regular basis, checking in with you as the parent on a regular basis. So you have your case manager, you probably have your school counselor or a social worker, and then you should have the parents, the student, and at least 1 or 2 teachers, along with probably some type of administration. And so whenever any decisions are being made about accommodations or any change to an IEP or starting of an IEP, that whole team does need to get together to make the decisions as a whole group. So when it comes to an IEP accommodation, it could be anything from reducing the amount of work that needs to be done and the student earning the same amount of credit, or maybe determining that your student, because of a learning disability, cannot be in a general ed classroom because maybe they're not quite at that level yet. So maybe for them to graduate from high school, they're not having to complete all of the high school level courses. And of course, an IEP and a 504 can be brought in at any time, at any age. I, of course, always think high school because I'm a high school counselor, but an IEP and 504 can start right away at kindergarten. So if you see your students struggling, it is your right as a parent to ask for these things. Again, as a parent and as a school counselor, I would always encourage you to discuss the 504 route first, unless you know maybe your child was born with a learning disability that you've known about from the start, or with a physical disability that's requiring them to be in a wheelchair and thus not able to participate in things like FIED, things like that. If you know right off the bat, then of course go right to that individual education plan from the start. But otherwise, we always try to do the least restrictive plan first. So 504, if the 504 has been tried for a quarter or 2 and you're just not seeing the improvement, the type of support that you feel your student needs, you can ask for more. So the 504, though, just for some background, is something that the school has to approve and agree upon. You as a parent could say, I'd like one, but the school must be on board with it, with even, having the conversation about it, which I know doesn't quite make a ton of sense, but that's the way it's structured. And then the IEP, you as a parent can say at any time, I want my child tested. And as soon as you say those words, they have to begin the process. They cannot say, no, we don't think your child is meeting the requirements. If you as a parent say, I want it, the federal law says that they have to then go through the steps to have your child tested. That does not necessarily mean that your child would be approved and granted an IEP, because there are several stipulations that they have to meet those requirements in order for it to happen. But you can at least ask to have them tested if you feel like they really need that level of care. If you're not quite sure, you can always just ask to talk with a counselor or even someone from special ed. And typically they would have those conversations with you kind of, just on the side. If you say like, here's what I'm seeing in my student, what do you think about asking for an IEP? Then they would typically have a conversation with you just, to discuss what your options might be and what they think as would be the best plan for them going forward. So that's something to keep in mind, that you can't always get them, but they are available there as options for you. Then the most important thing, once your child gets a 504 or an IEP, is to make sure that everyone is on board and following those plans. They are legal documents. They are federal documents. They have to be followed. So this is the time that I tend to hear from other friends and friends of friends who say, my school is not following it. My child has an IEP, or my child has a 504. The teachers aren't, able to provide all the accommodations. This is when, unfortunately, you have, as a parent, have to advocate for your child, and you need to go, starting with their case manager, and talk with them and say, this is what's happening, this is what I'm seeing, and ask them how they can help you remedy that. If that doesn't work, then I encourage you to move on up the chain, okay? If you have to go to the principal or the superintendent, so be it. There are also some really great lawyers out here, some law firms that focus solely on working with families who have educational concerns, especially when it comes to the 504 and IEP plans. So just know that you have resources, and you have to be your child's biggest advocate when it comes to concerns about them not getting the education that they need, that they deserve, that they are legally entitled to. That's the most important thing to remember, is everyone is entitled to a free and well-performed, well-enforced educational plan, right? Every child deserves that. And it might be different from one child to the next. And I know there's lots of districts that want your kid to just fit into that box. And when they don't fit in, they tend to drag their feet. But please know, your child has that right, and they deserve it. So if you have any other questions about this, of course, always please comment and let me know. But just keep in mind, you have the right to choose your child's education. It is your choice, along with your child, of course. Hopefully you're speaking with them, but it is your choice. So you get the right. You get to say what you want to have happen. So hopefully that was helpful. And again, let me know if you have any questions.